Welcome back to the deep dive. We're here again, taking some really complex source material, this time focusing on prophecy, and trying to, well, make it digestible for you.
That's the goal.
Today, we are really strapping in. We're doing a deep dive into Revelation chapter 12. It's not just about the big cosmic battle everyone pictures.
No, not just that. The sources we're looking at treat this chapter with incredible precision. They see it as a key part of a very meticulous timeline.
Right. So our mission for you listening is to help you quickly grasp who's who, the woman, the man-child, the dragon, but maybe even more crucially, to understand the specific timing and the role given to the 144,000. Because in this view, they're like the central gear in the whole mechanism.
Exactly. This interpretation sees them as the absolute linchpin for how the end times unfold. Get them wrong or place them wrong, and the whole structure, according to these sources, just falls apart.
It does feel a bit like looking at architectural blueprints for prophecy, doesn't it? But okay, before we even start decoding the characters, we need to lay down the ground rules. The sources demand a specific framework.
Yes, very systematic. This isn't just throwing ideas around. The entire interpretation rests on 5, you could say, non-negotiable premises. You kind of have to accept these, or at least understand them, for the rest of it to click.
They form the lens, basically.
Precisely, the foundational lens. Without it, the connections made later just won't seem logical within this specific interpretive model.
Okay, let's unpack that lens then. Premise number 1 focuses on a group everyone seems to talk about, the 144,000.
Yeah, premise 1 is all about consolidation. The source is adamant. The 144,000 sealed from the 12 tribes in Revelation 7. They're exactly the same group as the 144,000 standing with the Lamb on Mount Zion in Revelation 14.
So no wiggle room there. Not symbolic numbers representing different things?
Nope, not in this view. It's one singular, specific, literal group. Their sealing in chapter 7 is the preparation. Their standing in chapter 14 is like the triumphant result. Same people.
Okay, that definitely raises the stakes for who they are and what they do, which I guess leads us right into premise 2.
It does. Premise 2 connects them directly to the action. They aren't just passively sealed. They are the first fruits redeemed from humanity, yes. But the source explicitly says they are the 2 witnesses from Revelation 11.
Whoa, okay. That's a big connection. The 2 witnesses who prophesy for 12,260 days?
How does the source justify merging this specific number, 144,000, with that narrative role? That changes them from just being protected to being, well, incredibly powerful actors on the world stage.
It's justified mainly through the unique authority they wield. We'll get more into the specifics of the latter reign later, but the argument is essentially this. Look at the powers described for the 2 witnesses.
Right, striking the earth with plagues, calling down fire. Pretty intense stuff. Exactly. The source asks who else in Revelation has that kind of power and is present during that specific period. The argument is only a group sealed, perfected, and specially empowered like the 144,000 could possibly fulfill that protective, authoritative role for the church during the beast's reign. Gives them a very literal job to do in that time frame.
Okay, I see the logic there within their framework. It assigns them a crucial function. Now, switching gears to the antagonist. Premise 3 nails down the timing for the big war in heaven.
Yes. That famous scene, Michael casting the dragon down to earth, Revelation 12, verses 7 to 9. The source firmly places this event during the 5th trumpet.
The 5th trumpet, how do they link it?
They connect it directly to Revelation 9, verse 1. Remember where a star falls from heaven to earth. That star is interpreted as Satan the dragon. And he's given the key to the bottomless pit right then. So the cosmic showdown, Satan being kicked out of heaven for good and coming down into fury, isn't just some abstract event. It happens precisely when the trumpet judgments really kick into high gear. It marks a new, intensified phase of trouble for the earth.
Got it. So the final judgments start, and boom, Satan is cast down, furious. What about the 144,000 being sealed? When does that process finish?
That's premise 4. The sealing process has to wrap up right at the 6th seal. Think about the sequence. The 6th seal opens, there's this massive cosmic disturbance, earthquake, sun darkens, stars fall. Then immediately after that description, before the 7th seal is open, Revelation 7 inserts the scene of the 144,000 being sealed.
Okay.
For this interpretation, that timing is critical. It means the divinely appointed fixed number of martyrs and witnesses needed for God's plan must be fully accounted for, sealed, and ready just before the Lamb opens that 7th seal, which ushers in the absolute final stage of judgment.
So completing the sealing is like the necessary prerequisite, the trigger for the ultimate judgment phase. And the final premise, number 5, ties this all back to the Old Testament, specifically the Day of Atonement.
This is where it gets really intricate, I think. Premise 5 connects the seventh seal opening directly to the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. Remember in Revelation 8, when the seventh seal is opened, there's silence in heaven, and then an angel offers incense with the prayers of the saints. The source sees that incense as the direct parallel to Leviticus 16, where the high priest took the censer with burning coals and incense into the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement. It was about cleansing the sanctuary, covering the mercy seat.
Okay, so how does that ancient ritual mirror the end times judgment in Revelation?
Well, the historical Day of Atonement was the ultimate day for removing sin from the sanctuary and the entire community of Israel. So when this incense rises symbolically at the seventh seal, it's signaling that the preparation for the final cosmic cleansing is now complete. The prayers are ascending. The last first fruits, the 144,000, have been gathered and sealed.
Right.
Humanity's required part in the process, providing these perfected witnesses, is finished. This allows the divine judgment and final cleansing to proceed through the trumpets and the vials. The whole sequence of Revelation, in this view, structurally mirrors that annual atonement ritual.
Wow. Okay, that is a really robust, deeply theological framework. If we accept those 5 points, especially the 144,000 as the witnesses and that atonement link, then yeah, we have the foundation needed to start placing the characters of Revelation 12 onto this specific timeline. All right, let's do that. Let's move to the absolute center of the chapter, this mysterious one, Revelation 12, verses 1 and 2. She's clothed with the sun, moon under her feet, 12 stars, but she's also in agony, about to give birth.
Yeah, she's a fascinating figure, and her identity, according to the sources, actually shifts or evolves. We need to start by grounding her in the Old Testament. That imagery, sun, moon, 12 stars, is incredibly specific.
It rings a bell. Genesis, right? Joseph's dream.
Exactly. Genesis 37. Joseph dreams the sun, moon, and 11 stars are bowing to him, typically interpreted as his father Jacob, sun, his mother, moon, or perhaps Jacob's wives collectively, and his 11 brothers, stars, representing the core of the future tribes of Israel. So a woman crowned with 12 stars, it immediately points to the 12 tribes of Israel.
Okay, so initially, the woman is the physical nation of Israel, the Old Testament church, you could say. The people chosen receive God's promises and the covenant.
Yes, she's the lineage God chose, the nation from which the Messiah was promised. She got the law, the prophets, the first covenant. But, and this is a really crucial distinction the sources make, just being born into that physical lineage wasn't, the whole story, wasn't enough to guarantee faithfulness.
And this is where the internal conflict comes in. The sources mention a struggle within the woman herself.
Absolutely. They highlight that within physical Israel, well, many were descendants of Abraham by blood, sure. But they weren't truly living as images of God. They were, in the strong language of the prophets sometimes, sons of the serpent. So the woman, before she gives birth, represents this chosen but often flawed nation, struggling, going through these birth pangs to bring forth the perfect offspring, the Messiah.
Okay, so how does giving birth change her identity then?
This is the critical transition point, the New Covenant bridge. After Christ is born, the man-child, the woman, through him, gives rise to the true Israel. And this true Israel is the church. It's established by the New Covenant, sealed with Christ's own blood. The focus shifts completely from bloodline ancestry to spiritual commitment and faith in the Messiah.
Ah, so the woman after the birth embodies the spiritual remnant, those who follow Christ, whether they were originally Jewish or Gentile.
Precisely. It's the completion of the type. She evolves from the preparatory physical nation, Israel, into the completed spiritual reality, the church. And the key factor becomes being an image of God through faith, not just physical lineage.
So a really dynamic identity. And her offspring, the man-child, he's the catalyst for this change, and he immediately becomes the target of the dragon.
Yes, the dragon. Described with all that terrifying imagery, 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 crowns, pulling a third of the stars from heaven. This is unmistakably Satan, the old serpent, the accuser, the deceiver of the whole world. And his goal is starkly simple: destroy the man-child the moment he appears.
And the man-child is, well, seems pretty clear.
Unambiguously, Jesus Christ, yes. Born from the woman Israel, and Revelation 12, verse 5 explicitly says he is destined to rule all nations with a rod of iron. That's a direct quote from Psalm 2, locking in his messianic identity and authority. The dragon waiting to devour him at birth. That echoes Herod's attempt to kill the infant Jesus.
But that initial confrontation at Christ's birth and life, it resolves relatively quickly in the text here.
It does. The victory isn't portrayed as a prolonged battle at that point. Jesus overcomes Satan definitively. through his death and resurrection, the cross. And then verse 5 says, he is immediately caught up to God and to his throne. This is the pivotal event marking his ascension. It also significantly marks the conclusion of the 69th week of Daniel's prophecy, according to this framework.
Okay, now you mentioned earlier we have to be super careful with this caught up phrase. This is where major chronological errors creep in if people misinterpret it.
Yes, this is a point the source material hammers home. It is critical not to confuse the man-child, Jesus being caught up at his ascension, with the first resurrection, which is the catching up or rapture of the saints later on.
Right, one is historical, one is future.
Exactly. The man-child is Christ. His ascension already happened. It concluded his earthly ministry. If you mistake that event for the future resurrection of believers, you basically derail the entire end-time sequence that these sources lay out.
How specifically does that derail it? And what about the rod of iron rule? Does he rule with that now?
Good question. While Christ certainly reigns from the throne now, the source specifically links the rod of iron phrase from Revelation 12.5 to his future judgment when he returns. It signifies the forceful crushing of Earth's rebellious nations at the second coming. It's about ultimate judgment, not just his current spiritual reign.
I see.
So, if you conflate his ascension with the saints' resurrection, you might wrongly assume the saints are already ruling with that rod of iron, or worse, you might misplace the crucial 12,260 days of tribulation to occur after the saints are supposedly gone. That completely undermines the whole purpose of the tribulation as described here, which involves the suffering and martyrdom of saints on earth. The man-child's ascension is history, the saints' resurrection is eschatology, two distinct events.
Okay, that distinction is crystal clear now. So players establish Israel evolving into the church, woman, Christ victorious and ascended, man-child, and Satan cast down and furious dragon. Now let's bring back the human group whose actions really define this final timeline, the 144,000.
Right, this group. They carry enormous significance in this interpretation. They aren't just a symbolic number. They are presented as the necessary instrument for divine justice and the ultimate proof of God's plan working out through free will.
We established they are the first fruits, and they are the two witnesses. Let's revisit their sealing and how it connects to this idea of an appointed number of martyrs.
Because the source takes 144,000 as a literal, precise number, it represents the exact quota needed to complete God's redemptive plan for the entire created order. Their sealing during the sixth seal signals that the count is almost complete. The required number of witnesses, those who will faithfully testify for Jesus, even face death, for it is reaching its fullness. This sealing is their final preparation for their unique, powerful, and concluding ministry.
And the sources really emphasize their purity, right? Not defiled with women, no deceit, without fault. That phrase, not defiled with women, can be controversial. How does the source handle that?
Yeah, the interpretation here is definitely spiritual, not necessarily demanding literal celibacy, though it doesn't exclude it. In Revelation symbolism, women often represent churches or broader religious systems.
Right.
Think of the harlot Babylon. So, not defiled with women is interpreted to mean they haven't engaged in spiritual adultery or fornication. Meaning they haven't compromised their faith, haven't mixed true worship with the false doctrines or the demands of the beast system. They represent absolute fidelity, a moral and spiritual integrity completely untainted by the lies and pressures of the world system during that final test.
And this profound purity, this unblemished character, is what qualifies them to receive immense power, this latter reign of the Holy Spirit you mentioned.
That's the core connection.
Right, yeah.
That's why they can be the two witnesses. The early reign is seen as the gift of the Spirit given Pentecost onwards, enabling initial faith, conversion, growth for all believers through the church age. The latter reign, however, is described as a special, intensified outpouring, granted specifically to these 144,000 just before and during the final crisis.
And this latter reign gives them what exactly?
It grants them the extraordinary, frankly supernatural authority described for the two witnesses in Revelation 11.
Let's spell those powers out again. It's pretty dramatic.
It really is. Power to shut up the heavens so it doesn't rain during their prophecy, power to strike the earth with any plague as often as they desire, and power to consume their enemies with fire that comes out of their mouths. The source argues this level of, well, almost offensive divine power must come from this unique latter rain anointing. It makes them virtually invulnerable until their 12,260-day testimony is complete. They're not just preaching. They are actively using divine power to shield the faithful remnant of the church.
Okay, we definitely need to tackle the most dramatic claim here. The cosmic stakes tied to this literal number, 144,000.
Yeah, this is where the interpretation really puts everything on the line. The source holds that if even one single individual out of that literal 144,000 fails, if they give in, if they renounce their faith under pressure, if they fall short of that without false standard, then God's promise, God's entire plan for redemption is fundamentally broken.
Wow. Broken how?
The implication is that the entire created order would be doomed because it would prove Satan's point that created beings, given free will, cannot ultimately maintain perfect faithfulness when the pressure is greatest. It would invalidate God's character and his law.
That seems incredibly precarious. So Satan just needs to corrupt one person out of 144,000. He wins if he gets 143,999 to stand firm, but just one cracks. Doesn't that create a huge tension with free will itself? If God has to guarantee their perfection, did they really freely choose it?
That's the exact philosophical knot the source tries to untangle. And they address it directly. They reconcile it by arguing that the perfection of the 144,000 isn't God overriding their will. It's the culmination of their free will, perfected through immense trial and total surrender. God's sealing isn't a robotic programming. It's a divine recognition and confirmation.
A confirmation of what?
A confirmation, based on God's perfect foreknowledge and judgment, that their faithfulness has reached a point where it is absolutely unwavering. They've matured through the power of the Spirit and their own choices to a state where the option to betray Christ simply no longer exists for them. Their character is fixed in righteousness.
So they become the ultimate exhibit. The proof shown to the entire universe, angels, demons, everyone, that God's commands are righteous and that creatures can choose to obey perfectly even under extreme duress.
That's precisely it. Their success validates God's law and his character. Their unwavering faithfulness demonstrates that free will, when fully yielded to God, can achieve an unbreakable, permanent commitment. And this, in turn, removes any future basis for questioning God or rebelling among the redeemed creation.
Okay, let's lock down the timing again. Their sealing concludes at the sixth seal, acting as the trigger.
Yes. The moment that number, 144,000, is complete and sealed, it signifies that the necessary first fruits from humanity are ready. This directly leads to the preparations for the Great Day of Atonement. That incense rising at the seventh seal, it confirms the prep work is done. The gathering of these final perfected saints is the last act of human faithfulness required before the cosmic cleansing can begin.
And that cleansing begins immediately with the subsequent judgment.
Exactly. The trumpets and vials follow, executing that final atonement. So the count has to be finished, the witnesses have to be sealed and ready before that ultimate judgment sequence can logically commence. No final judgment until the proof of righteousness is locked in.
Okay. Now, to fully grasp the context for this judgment, we need to zoom out again and place these events within that larger prophetic framework you mentioned earlier, Daniel's 70 weeks.
Right, Daniel chapter 9. It's really the master clock for prophetic timing in many interpretations, including this one. It lays out 77s of years, 490 years total, decreed for Israel and Jerusalem to accomplish major redemptive goals: finish transgression and sin, atone for wickedness, bring in everlasting righteousness, seal up vision and prophecy, and anoint most holy.
And the sources generally agree that the first 69 of those weeks, or 483 years, run up to about the time of Christ's ministry.
Correct. The 69th week culminates around Christ's crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension, precisely when the man-child is caught up to the throne in Revelation 12.
And then critically, the sources we're looking at basically skip over the last 2,000 years, the church age. They treat it like a pause in the prophetic clock.
That's the common interpretation, yes. They see it as a parenthesis, an uncounted interval between the 69th and the 70th week. So, narratively, they jump straight from Christ's ascension into the events of the final 7-year period. The last week, the last 7, sometimes called the final heptad.
And this final 7-year block is where all the intense action of Revelation really unfolds, particularly that recurring number, 1,260 days.
Exactly. That 1,260 days, which is also called 42 months, or a time, times and half a time, 3.5 years, is the absolutely critical marker within this final 7-year week. It defines the period known as the Great Tribulation.
And what defines that period?
Intense persecution of the woman, the church, by the dragon, acting through the beast power. According to the sources, this period officially kicks off when the figure Paul calls the man of sin, or Daniel calls the abomination of desolation, sets himself up in a position of ultimate authority, demanding worship. This act marks the start of the Great Tribulation specifically for the saints still on earth.
Okay, and during these 1,260 days, what happens to the saints? You mentioned two paths.
That's right. The source points to Revelation 12 and 13, showing two simultaneous realities. A core part of the woman, the church, is miraculously protected, fleeing to a prepared place in the wilderness for that exact duration, 12,060 days. That's the refuge.
And the other path?
Simultaneously, other faithful saints who are not in that specific refuge face the full fury of the beast. They are hunted down, persecuted, and many are martyred. This fulfills the appointed number of martyrs that needs to be reached. The whole point of this 1260-day period from the beast's perspective is to force allegiance through mandatory worship. And from God's perspective, it's the final test that sorts the faithful, fills the martyr quota, and confirms the sealing of the 144,000.
Right. This brings us to probably the most contentious timing issue in these interpretations. When do these 1,260 days occur within the final 7 years? The source material is very firm on this, isn't it? It must be the first half.
Absolutely insistent. View 1, the preferred interpretation here, is that the 12,260 days of Great Tribulation are the first half of the final 7-year week, the first heptad. They argue this period is defined by the beast's persecution of the saints, which logically must happen before the period of God's wrath poured out on the beast's followers.
Okay, let's walk through the logic. Why must it be the first half? What breaks down if you try to place it in the second half?
The entire logic hinges on the presence and status of the saints on earth. Persecution only makes sense if there are saints to persecute. The woman fleeing for refuge only makes sense if she's being pursued what's still on earth. The two witnesses doing their protective miracles only make sense if there's a faithful remnant needing protection from the beast's system.
Right.
So the source provides a pretty detailed refutation of the alternative view, view 2, which tries to place the 12,260 days in the second half, often arguing it starts in the middle of the week, based on some interpretations of Daniel 9.27.
Okay, let's break down that refutation. What's the first major problem if the tribulation is the second half?
Problem 1. If the 12,260 days of the beast's main reign of terror are the second half of the week, then the first resurrection, the catching up of the saints, would have to happen right at the midpoint of the week, just before those 12,260 days begin.
Okay, so what's the issue with that?
The issue is, if the resurrection happens midweek, then all the faithful saints are instantly removed from the earth. They're caught up into the air. Who's left?
Only the wicked, those who follow the beast.
Exactly. Only beast worshippers remain, which leads directly to problem 2, the redundancy of mandatory worship.
Ah, I see. If everyone left is already a follower, why would the beast need to keep forcing worship or persecuting people for not worshiping?
Precisely. The whole point of the Mark of the Beast Sister and the intense pressure to worship his image is to target the faithful, to force their hand, to root them out, and ultimately to fill that martyr quota. If all the faithful are already gone via resurrection, the mechanism of tribulation becomes completely pointless for the second half of the week. He's already won dominion over everyone left.
Makes sense. And there was a third problem, related to the plagues.
Yes, problem 3 concerns the nature of God's judgment during that second half. The second half of the week in this timeline is when the 7 bowls of God's wrath are poured out. These are described in Revelation 16 as horrific plagues, falling specifically on those who have the mark of the beast and worship his image.
Okay.
So the source finds it totally illogical to have a period where the beast is supposedly mandating worship, while at the exact same time, God is pouring out the most severe, agonizing plagues directly upon those very worshipers. It just doesn't align. The period of persecution, first half, must end before the period of God's direct judgment on the persecutors, second half, begins.
Okay, yeah, that logic seems pretty tight within this framework. First half, persecution of saints, martyrdom, refuge, 2 witnesses active. Second half, saints removed, wrath poured on the wicked.
That's the structure. It keeps the character roles consistent. The 144,000, as the 2 witnesses, have their specific 12,260-day job in the first half, protecting the church right up until the moment their mission ends and the martyr count is complete.
Which sets the stage perfectly for the climax of those first 12,260 days. What happens the instant that martyr number is hit? The last of the 144,000 is sealed.
The moment that divine count is precisely fulfilled, bang, the single greatest event of the end times occurs. The first resurrection. This is when the saints receive their reward, their glorification.
And this is timed, you said, exactly to the sounding of the 7th trumpet.
Correct. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 talks about the resurrection happening at the last trumpet. Within this literal interpretation, the 7th trumpet is that final decisive signal. Its blast triggers the transformation. The dead in Christ rise first, Then the living faithful are changed in the twinkling of an eye, and all are caught up together to meet the Lord in the air. They receive their immortal spiritual bodies.
And this is the event that shortens the days of tribulation for the elect.
Yes, it removes them entirely from the period of God's direct physical wrath that follows. They escape the 7 plagues.
Let's just emphasize again what this midweek resurrection means for planet Earth. It's a radical shift.
Absolutely fundamental. After the first resurrection, according to this view, there are literally no redeemed saints left physically on the earth. The entire remaining human population consists of those who sided with the beast, took the mark, and rejected God. The planet is essentially handed over, temporarily, to the wicked. The stage is completely cleared of the righteous.
Which makes the nature of the second half of the week unambiguous.
Unambiguous judgment. Pure wrath. This is when the 7 plagues, the bowls of wrath from Revelation 16, are poured out upon this now entirely wicked world population during that final 3.5-year period.
And where are the saints during this?
Safe. Glorified. In heaven, figuratively standing by the sea of glass, singing the song of Moses and the Lamb. Revelation 15 mentions the temple in heaven being filled with smoke from God's glory, and crucially, no one was able to enter the temple until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were completed. This signifies the time for intercession or mercy is over. It's purely judgment time.
So this whole sequence, tribulation, resurrection, wrath, it serves both God's cosmic purpose and ensures individual redemption is complete.
Yes. Cosmically, the first resurrection, triggered by the completion of the 144,000's faithful witness, is the definitive public vindication of God's righteousness and his law. It proves creation can't achieve faithfulness. Individually, for the redeemed, sin is now impossible. Their free will is perfected eternally in their glorified state.
And the first resurrection, happening at the 7th trumpet, becomes the visible start of that great atonement process we talked about earlier.
Exactly. It fulfills the ritual. The sealing of the 144,000 made the final atonement possible by providing the perfect representatives. The 7th trumpet initiates the judgment phase that executes that atonement across the cosmos, purging sin definitively from the created order.
Okay, let's loop back to Revelation 12 now, specifically verses 12 through 17. This happens right after the dragon is cast down, which you placed at the 5th trumpet. He's furious.
Yes, Revelation 12.12 spells out his motivation. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time. His time in heaven is over. His ultimate defeat is certain. So his immediate focus is maximum destruction on earth, targeting the woman, the church.
And she flees. Verse 14 says she's given 2 wings of a great eagle to fly to her place in the wilderness, where she's nourished for, there is again, 1,260 days.
That specific duration ties it perfectly. Her time in refuge is exactly concurrent with the 12,260 days of Great Tribulation, the first half of the week. And those 2 wings of a great eagle, the source sees that as a direct callback to Exodus 19.4.
Where God says he bore Israel on eagle's wings out of Egypt.
Precisely. It signifies miraculous divine protection and deliverance, providing a literal physical place of sanctuary for this core remnant of the church, hidden away from the beast's direct power for that period.
But the dragon doesn't give up. He tries a different tactic. Verse 15. The serpent spews water like a river out of his mouth to sweep the woman away. We need to decode that symbol. What's the river of water?
Yeah, symbolism is key here. In prophetic language, waters or floods can often represent masses of people, nations, chaos, or overwhelming force. The source leans towards interpreting this river from the dragon's mouth primarily as a flood of false doctrines and maybe also worldly power and persecution.
So less a literal tsunami, more like
an overwhelming torrent of lies, propaganda, deceptive philosophies, coupled perhaps with sudden waves of political or military pressure aimed at destroying the church's faith, stability, and even physical existence in her refuge, trying to flood her out.
a flood of deception and force. But it doesn't work. Verse 16 says the earth helps the woman. The earth opens its mouth and swallows the river. How does the earth help?
This is fascinating. The earth, kajn in Greek, could literally mean the physical ground providing sanctuary, perhaps concealing the refuge. But the source suggests the primary way the earth helps is through the active intervention of God's agents still operating on the earth during that time, namely, the 144,000, the 2 witnesses.
Ah, so their power comes into play here.
Yes, their divine authority, that latter reign power, allows them to counteract the dragon's flood. Maybe they supernaturally expose the lies, neutralize the threats, protect the boundaries of the refuge. The physical realm, the earth, responds to their divinely given authority, effectively swallowing the dragon's attack.
Okay, so that attack fails. And the dragon, now even more enraged, pivots. Verse 17 says he goes off to make war with the rest of her offspring. Who are the rest of her offspring?
The text defines them immediately. Those who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Since the main body of the woman is protected in the wilderness refuge, this remnant, or rest of her seed, that the dragon now targets must be the faithful outside that specific protected zone.
And given the framework, that has to be.
It has to be the two witnesses, the 144,000. According to the source, they are the ones still actively confronting the beast system out in the world during these first 1,260 days, holding the testimony, keeping the commandments under fire. The dragon's final direct battle on earth during this period is against them until their testimony is finished, the martyr quote is full, and the seventh trumpet sounds.
Wow. So Revelation 12, from the war in heaven triggered at the fifth trumpet, through the woman's birth pangs, the man-child's ascension, her flight, the dragon's failed flood attack, right down to the final conflict with the remnant. All of that action is packed into the first half of the final 7 years, orchestrated around the ministry and protection of the 144,000.
That's the interpretation. It makes Revelation 12 a tightly structured narrative, deeply connected to covenant history, but squarely focused on the events leading up to the first resurrection, all within that specific 1,260-day time frame.
This deep dive has definitely laid out an incredibly systematic and detailed way of reading Revelation 12 and slotting it into a precise timeline. Let's try to synthesize this a bit now. We have this idea of the ultimate cosmic day of atonement, and then the spiritual preparation needed for us as individual believers.
Right. On the grand scale, the Great Day of Atonement is that future historical event. It starts with the seventh trumpet, the first resurrection, and culminates at the very end of the 70 weeks, resulting in the complete eradication of sin from the entire created universe. It's the final justification of God's character before everyone.
But for us listening now, for the learner today, atonement isn't just future, it's personal, right? Through Christ's sacrifice.
Absolutely. That personal atonement is available now through faith in Christ's blood. It's what grants us the Holy Spirit, the early rain, as the source terms it. This makes our body a temple of God, fulfilling the new covenant promise where His law is written on our hearts. We already have access, through Christ, into the most holy place, into God's presence.
Okay, but this brings us back to that incredibly high standard set by the 144,000. They're described as without fault, basically unbreakable, having received that latter rain. How does the source contrast our current struggle under the early rain with their state?
The distinction is pretty stark. We, the church, now operate under the early rain. It empowers us, enables faith, allows for growth, but we're still very much in the fight. We can be tempted, we can stumble, we can grieve the Spirit, we can quench the Spirit's work in us. We can, frankly, betray our faith if we're not vigilant.
But the 144,000 are portrayed as being past that point.
Yes. By the time they are sealed and operating under the latter rain, they are seen as having achieved a concerned righteousness. They've reached a level of spiritual maturity, a fixed character, where their will is so perfectly aligned with God's that the choice to sin, the capacity to betray Him, is considered spiritually impossible for them. Their sealing is God's stamp of approval on that achieved, unwavering state.
So what's the takeaway? What lesson does this seemingly impossible standard of the 144,000 offer to us, the average believer still wrestling with sin day to day?
I think the lesson is that spiritual maturity isn't just some vague, fuzzy goal. It's presented here as a real, attainable, and ultimately necessary state of being. The source might point to someone like the Apostle Paul. Remember, near the end of his life, he says, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith.
Yeah.
There's a sense maybe that Paul himself reached a point of such deep, ingrained faithfulness, possibly for his martyrdom, that he became effectively incapable of turning back, incapable of betraying Christ. His character was sealed in righteousness.
So the potential is there for all believers to grow towards that kind of unwavering fidelity, even if we aren't literally among the final 144,000 who face the beast.
That seems to be the implication. The dramatic story of the 144,000 puts the spotlight back on our present commitment. If the fate of the cosmos, in this literal sense, hinges on 144,000 individuals achieving and maintaining perfect faithfulness under the most extreme pressure imaginable, well, it forces us to ask, what level of commitment, what depth of surrender, what pursuit of holiness does that demand from us right now?
That's a challenging thought. The maturity we're aiming for now isn't just for personal benefit, it's participating in the same kind of faithfulness that ultimately vindicates God.
It really challenges us to take our own sealing, the indwelling of the Holy Spirit we receive now, incredibly seriously. To not grieve him, not quench him, to actively cooperate with the Spirit in overcoming our sinful nature daily, striving for that maturity where faithfulness becomes second nature, where the allure of sin loses its power, making us, in our own sphere, untouchable by the destroyer.
A really profound connection there, linking the outcome of the biggest cosmic war imaginable right down to the choices we make in our hearts today. A demanding conclusion.
It is. It serves as a powerful reminder, perhaps, that every single act of faithfulness, every victory over temptation, matters. It contributes in its own way to the ultimate triumph of truth and righteousness, whether we live in the first century or face the final crisis.
Well, thank you. That was an incredibly thorough walkthrough of a very specific, very systematic interpretation of Revelation 12, the 144,000, and how it locks into this end times timeline, all based on the sources you brought today. It's certainly been an illuminating deep dive.
It was my pleasure. It's complex material, but fascinating when you see how the pieces fit together in this particular view. Thanks for the great questions.
And to you, the learner, thank you for sharing these sources with us and for joining us here on the deep dive. We genuinely hope this discussion has offered you a clearer, maybe more structured, and definitely a challenging perspective on this pivotal chapter of prophecy. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.